Okay, everybody, we have reached the bottom of the hour, so let's get started with today's LTEN webinar, How to Create a Strategic Blueprint for Efficient and Engaging Learning, sponsored by ClearPoint. My name is Tim Sosby. I'm Editorial Director for LTEN, and it's my pleasure to welcome you to today's program and to serve as the host of the webinar. I'm going to start by showing you a few housekeeping items here before we get into the program. Most importantly, I wanted to let you know about the questions feature. For those of you who don't know, the control panel on the right side of your screen has a questions module. You can type questions in there and hit the submit button. They'll be sent to us. We'll queue them up and ask them at the appropriate time throughout the webinar or at the Q&A toward the end of the hour. I always do urge everyone to ask any and all questions or comments you want to send in. Please do send them in as they occur while they're fresh in your mind, and we'll try to address them promptly as possible. I also wanted to point out on that control panel there's a handouts window. If you open up that, you'll see several handouts in there, including a copy of today's slides. We're also going to make those available on a web download for you throughout today's program. And there's also some information in there about LTEN that you might find valuable, a brochure about our upcoming conference. We'd love to have you join us for this summer, a little video telling you about LTEN, program about a PDF about our certificate programs, and some information for possible new members of LTEN. You're certainly welcome to just highlight in any of those titles and download them directly to your desktop as you would like. Today's webinar is being recorded and will be archived for future reference to the LTEN website. We're also going to send you a follow-up email about 1 hour after today's program ends, connecting you directly to the recording of today's program. So certainly feel free to check back on any of the recordings if there's anything you need to refresh on or whatnot at any point. I'm also going to ask you to help us out, speaking of following up. As we leave today's program, a follow-up survey is going to pop up on a separate browser window. Please do take a moment and look for that survey, and please do share your thoughts with us on today's program. We produce these programs for you, so of course your feedback is valuable as we plan future webinars. There'll also be a link in that follow-up email we send you to the survey, so one way or the other, please do share your thoughts with us. And along those lines, my email address is here on the screen, and I'll share it later as well. If I can help you before, during, or after any of our webinars, certainly don't hesitate to reach out. And finally, for those of you who are Twitter friendly, I wanted to make sure I pointed out our hashtag. We have a hashtag associated with this webinar, LTEN Learning. If you hear anything you want to share today or whatnot, feel free to do that through Twitter. And of course, we'd love to have you use that hashtag so we can track the conversation as well. All right, with all of that said, let me introduce you to your speakers today. There we go. Our speakers today are Kent Malmros and Laura Wilson, both from ClearPoint Learning. Kent is the Vice President of Global Strategy and Product for ClearPoint Learning. Kent joined ClearPoint in April of 2014, initially serving as ClearPoint's VP of Product and Alliances, responsible for managing existing partnerships and implementing a global product strategy. In addition to building ClearPoint's product strategy, Kent was also chartered with initiating development efforts on key offerings, and has also built a product management and services organization to support commercial implementation of these offerings. Laura is Director of Learning Strategies for ClearPoint Learning. Laura has worked in the life sciences industry for more than 12 years, specializing in designing learning programs for sales representatives, healthcare providers, and patients. In her role at ClearPoint, she's responsible for setting the strategic course for learning solutions, including needs analysis, curriculum design, digital and live programs, and evaluation. I know you're going to enjoy learning from Kent and Laura today, so I'm going to turn things over to Kent to get us started. Kent, welcome.
Thanks so much, Tim. I really appreciate the introduction. Happy to be working with you in LTEN again, and really excited about this topic. Tim, you know, we've spent some time together specifically looking at things that are near and dear to my heart as a product person, mobile delivery of training, measurement and analytics, and we think those are critically important. But the strategy side of me understands as well that there are a number of things going on at the macro level in the marketplace that impact our ability as trainers to do our job every day. The more we go out and sit with customers, the more we recognize some of those trends really just on a practical day-to-day level. And that's what we want to dive into today, is taking a step back, thinking about how we can revisit, for many of us, or potentially for the first time engage in the more strategic tenets of learning. And just a quick story, I mean, this has come about for us as we have sat with customers, specifically about 4 months ago. Laura and I were with a large pharma company who has many, many resources at their disposal. We had worked with them in the past. It was a bit of a reintroduction. We went through a capabilities deck. We showed them our mobile delivery capabilities. We talked about some of the things we do as an e-learning provider. And the customer sitting on the other side of the desk looked at us and said, I know what you guys do. I know you're good at certain things. And I know that we've leveraged that in the past. But what I really need right now is someone that can help me figure out the best way to use the 4 dozen e-learning vendors I have, the 70 LMSs I have. I get so caught up in my job day to day that I don't have time to step back and really think about my learning program strategically. And that's been a recurring theme. So Laura and I got together and we said, it'd be really great if we could put together an LTEN webinar where the entire focus was to just take a step back, create an interactive conversation, and really give this group who is attending a tool set that they can use after they leave today to apply to their job tomorrow. Ideally, you'll take 3 things away. They might be new. They might be refreshers. They could just be a reminder of how to go about getting strategic with your learning strategy. So where does that start? Laura and I have probably talked more than we could possibly even bring to you guys about the idea of context. And we talk about content in context. And we talk about the context of a learning strategy. And we think if you differentiate between strategy and tactics, and you have to really remind yourself of what that means, strategy is the what, it's the big picture. Tactics are the who and the how. How are you going to execute and deliver? And we know that it's very easy with pressure and deadlines and the velocity of business to just get into the tactics. So to really think about the strategy, it's critical to do some discovery, get back to the basics of understanding that context. We provided some questions that we think are really important to reflect on as a very first step when you're jumping into building a learning strategy. Who are key stakeholders? And this may seem obvious, but stakeholders are widening. The absolute necessity to get buy-in across different parts of an organization is changing so rapidly that thinking about the objectives of any given number of stakeholders being incorporated into a training program can open your eyes. How many people need to sign off on that strategy? Seems like an obvious question at times, but if you go back to the example I gave about, hey, I have 70 training platforms, and maybe you had got in your mind you want to use one of them. Maybe that budget is held elsewhere. Maybe you need more licenses. Maybe there is a requirement that an intersection or matrix organization has additional sign-offs that you haven't thought about. So the strategic elements of your strategy, as they certainly trickle down to tactics, require that thought process. I referenced technologies, but now not only who holds the budget, what do those technologies do? What are the feature function sets? Does it accomplish everything that you think you have in mind? And then, of course, how many learners are being impacted by your training solution? And is it a global audience? We'll talk about that a bit more later with one of our case studies, but we see these as being hypercritical questions to really fully understand and vet before you get into building that strategic blueprint. And once you have an understanding of that, you might also then at a larger level get a sense for the situation that you're in. We've outlined 4 that we're seeing over and over again as Laura and her team of learning strategists engage with companies out in the market. These aren't the only ones, and we're going to get to that in a second, but these are certainly recurring opportunities and scenarios that we've seen, and you can identify with some of them on some level, and we take it to a different place. So there's a startup, right? You're an emerging business. You've developed a molecule. You have all the approvals required, and you're coming to market. Maybe you're a single person in a training department, and you're building a commercial organization right now. The training requirements and the strategy that go into that are very different than an integration scenario. I think everyone can understand and relate to this on some level. If you haven't been directly impacted, you probably have peers who have been in a merger or acquisition scenario. Bring 2 training departments together, there's a lot to work through. That definitely brings together a number of assets that you might need to call through and a lot of questions that need to be answered. Legacy, companies that have just grown over time, long-term programs, many platforms, CBTs that have been built 2 or 3 times. There's a number of stakeholders that have ideas about programs they've done over the course of maybe a decade that have to be considered. And then there's evolution. Maybe your organization is thinking about different market access, globalization, new factors that go into a traditional training program, training department, and even a reuse scenario. So you might have and be willing to and wanting to deploy a training solution that has an evolutionary component that has to be considered. As simple as globalization, and I say simple meaning that's the simple word, but the factors that go into that are very, very sophisticated. So we want to jump right into some interactivity. I think, Laura, we're always interested to know what people are looking at, what situation they're coming from. So we just talked about those 4 different situations. Tim, we'll throw it to you for a poll. Which most closely represents your current situation in the audience? Are you a startup? Are you in an integration scenario, legacy, evolution, or something else? We'd love to get some inputs. Laura.
Well, thank you, Ken.
Tim,
I'm sorry, go ahead.
Yeah, go ahead.
No, I was just going to say everybody's voting very quickly, folks. If I could ask you to wrap up your voting as quickly as possible, we'll keep the program moving ahead for you.
Fantastic. And let us know when you have enough data to show, Tim. But I was going to ask Laura, who leads our learning strategy team, which of these situations would you say you've worked the most directly with in the past 12 or 18 months?
Hi, Kent. Thank you. I would say some of our more recent requests have been in folks who are evolving, looking to move from what already exists and adding new learning environments, new learning approaches in all that's going on in our industry, trying to keep ahead of the learning trends.
That's great. And I would agree with it, that as our focus and the focus you've been, I think, working on, but certainly I am seeing both a combination of startup and integration as being a potential driver for lots of disruption within training organizations. No question about that. So how's the response looking, Tim?
Well, thanks, both of you. The response is coming along great. Everybody, I'm going to go ahead and close off the poll at this point. We appreciate you sharing. Thank you for that. I'm going to close the poll and let's look at the results. And Kent and Laura, I will tell you, you're both very accurate.
I guess we aren't shocked then. The integration startup is smaller, but I'm curious if that will start to become more, like I said, potentially more of a disruptor. All right, well, wonderful. And I would say for the 5% of the others, we would like to know what your situation is. So please feel free to add that into the chat window. We can address that if there's questions about how some of the concepts we discussed could be applied in other situations, but definitely would like to know. So great, moving on. I think what's critical now is what do these situations have in common, even the other that we might not know about? There's an opportunity to explore a learning journey that focuses on 5 areas, and sometimes these can be sliced different ways, but we have absolutely seen these as common areas for any situation in which we're applying a learning strategy. Absolutely everyone thinks about content almost first and foremost. Asset mix and delivery, when we talk about that evolutionary situation, I'd reference globalization, Laura referenced the addition of new learning platforms. I think what we realize is that you might often consider an asset mix or delivery in that one-time situation that has a urgency or timeliness. And the key is to then think about it as part of these other 4 as well. So you might make a decision to deliver content with an asset mix that's heavily ebook dependent, but that decision might be made, for example, on a cost basis instead of simplicity of translation and localization. Learner engagement, we'll talk about in a bit more detail as well in a case study, but we often get inquiries and talk to people out in industry who specifically are focused on engagement or gamification strategies, maybe around an event. Coaching and measurement certainly are very critical to developing a strategic learning program. And so the key point for us is not to take these all in isolation, but to think about them all, I think, simultaneously. Sure. And yeah, go ahead.
I'm sorry. Before we move on, I apologize for interrupting. We've got some folks in the audience asking if you could define what asset mix means.
Oh, that's a great point, Tim. So yeah, I'll go back to that previous slide. When we talk about asset mix or delivery, different ways to think about that are different modalities or different media types or file types. So when we think about training assets as a term, something that maybe we use or our customers are familiar with, but not everyone uses together, different assets may be a computer-based training module or an e-learning module, a virtual classroom training type, an ebook, so different ways that content can be presented out to your learner audience. And so to that very point, as you develop those different situations for very specific opportunities, that's when that proliferation of programs, platforms, technologies all happens at the same time. And so you collect things because you may be developing content and different types of assets around that content, different types of media around a POA or around a specific launch event or around a specific compliance training event. And that is where, particularly in evolution or legacy scenarios, you start to have to really parse through what is at your disposal and those different contextual elements to figure out the best strategy. So we come back to some additional discovery questions that can put this all together, think about those 5 components, and really start to help nail down what you have at hand and what you might be able to consider doing with it. Does your content reflect business objectives? And that content could be content you're having developed right now, or one of the 300 ebooks, PDFs, e-learning modules that you've had previously built that maybe you're not even fully aware of. Is your training delivery evolving in ways to take advantage of new platforms? So I referenced engagement and gamification. Have you considered ways to keep learners engaged? Those 2 questions can go together, but if you haven't thought about these questions in advance, you might not be considering them together, and that's a really critical element as well. Do you link your training and coaching efforts to support learning throughout the experience? The coaching we're seeing is becoming a critical piece to bring up in our conversations because, frankly, it's often a gap, as is measurement, the last conversation. Everyone aspires to do it, but we might not have it considered all the way through from the beginning. So, Laura, talk about how these can come together a little bit more.
Sure. So thanks, Kent. And that was a great question, and thank you for asking it, and certainly hope to clarify it a bit more in terms of asset mix and delivery. And so you can see here, this is our conceptual strategic blueprint, taking those 5 critical components that Kent has described, and we're visualizing them as 5 different rooms in our blueprint, and helping you think about how these integrate together. As Kent has said, we often, as trainers, think about each and every one of these things, but we may think of them in isolation. And by bringing them all together in one document, one blueprint, it gives you the chance to see how these 5 elements inform and interact with each other. And so just to go a little deeper on each one of them, as Kent said, we typically start, and we hear our clients are typically starting with the content. This is where you as trainers are identifying with your team what it is that you want your learners to know, say, and do as a result of the training. What are the learning objectives that you will be setting out for this course of training? And therefore, what will the topics be and the order of the topics? So that defines the content bucket. It's really the basis of what you want to share with your learners. Then as the next icon, the asset mix shows, is that this is exactly what Kent described. It could be a mix of virtual assets, live training, podcasts, videos, or even social collaboration that you put together, all of the different ways that you can share the content with your learners. And so you might think about various topics lend themselves to certain kinds of assets, and we'll show some examples of that. The third idea is learner engagement, and certainly one of the key areas we talk about learner engagement is gamification and competition. I know that's something that many of you may be thinking about. We even want to broaden that idea of engagement to encourage you to think about having a learning philosophy, an engagement philosophy that helps you think about whether your learning event is 3 days, 3 weeks, or 3 months. How will you keep your learners engaged in the content over time? And we'll share some examples of models that may help you do that. The fourth room is coaching, and in many conversations with clients, we talk about coaching and hear it often referred to as the thing that happens when the training is done. And so that there's a training event, and then there's some pull-through and coaching opportunities. And we encourage our own work to include integrated coaching opportunities so that it's not only something that happens at the end, but becomes an integral part of the planning that you do. And then finally, of course, in a whole group of trainers, we would be remiss not to talk about the importance of measurement and having that measurement plan as integrated into the learning journey as possible. So as you start thinking about all 5 of these elements to create your strategic blueprint, you will see that in some cases, one or more of these will be more important than others, depending on the situation that brings you to creating a blueprint. But we offer all 5 for your consideration as a starting point. And the one thing that we will also ask you to keep in mind is that this blueprint can be used in a variety of training situations, whether that's new hire training, product launch, advanced selling skills, or even very particular types of workshops that you might be looking to hold. You can use this blueprint outline as an idea regardless of the training type. So Tim, before I go on, I just want to see if anybody has any questions about these 5 areas.
And nothing's in right now, Laura.
Okay, great. Just want to make sure, because they are, as you can see, the core of what we're talking about today. So we are going to move on to our next activity, which, there we go, is a poll. And just again, for us to get an understanding of what you're all thinking about and challenged by. I know Kent introduced some discovery questions before with the idea of keeping a training program in mind. So maybe you could think about some training that you're currently thinking of planning, and you could identify for us any of these 5 areas that may be a challenge for you. You may have 1 or more areas that you want to learn more about or feel challenged by. So as a reminder, content is understanding the learning objectives and the topics that you want to share. The asset mix is how you will deliver that content, whether that's live or self-paced learning. The learner engagement is a philosophy or approaches to keeping learners engaged over time. Coaching is how you integrate those opportunities for the learners, managers, and others to provide feedback during the learning journey. And then finally, measurement of how your learners, where they started, what they've learned, where they're finishing along the journey, whether that's knowledge, attitude, or skills. So Tim, just a pulse on how the polling is going.
Well, it looks like about everybody has voted, folks. I will ask you to wrap up your choices here quickly, and we'll share the results.
Laura, I think it's safe to say that we see content and certainly asset mix are things that typically are in the forefront of people's mind. Engagement increasingly so. Probably coaching and measurement, in our experience, are among the 2 more challenging to ensure get into every learning solution. Fair to say that?
I would agree, but they're definitely on people's minds, but not necessarily seen as an integrated part of designing the solution.
Well, it looks like almost everybody has voted, so I'm going to go ahead and close off the poll. Everybody, thank you again for sharing on the polling here. Let's look at the results. Kent and Laura, here you go.
Interesting. I was trying to guess where I thought people's greatest challenge would be, given where, knowing what we hear from our clients and keeping up with industry news. And I'm certainly not surprised to see learner engagement fairly high. I am interested in seeing how high coaching and measurement are in relation. I guess it bears out in some ways, Kent, what we were saying, that that's not always easy for people to mix in with the content and assets. Anything you would reflect on, Ken?
Yeah, I'm curious as well, and certainly, again, please feel free to add comments. The learner engagement component may be more reflective of how challenging that continues to be, not even that it's a challenge to try to add or consider in a strategic blueprint, but it's just a challenging topic, period.
Mm-hmm. Right. Yeah, very true. Great. Well, thank you, Tim. So what we'll do next is move from sort of these concepts we've been sharing to actually showing you 3 case examples of client situations and how a strategic blueprint helped address their questions. And so our first example, if you think back to our different categories, this is an example reflecting one training department that actually has sort of a mix of both integrating and evolving situations. And so it started with our client saying, our U.S. training team has been in place for about 6 months. So this was a small company that did not have a centralized training function. They had established a training team and had determined that their priority was to standardize the practices across their 5 business units in the U.S. and then also partner with their global training team to think about how to standardize training across 5 regions around the world. So 5 business units, 5 regions. And while they were considering that, they also acquired a product line from another company. Along with that product line, they had the opportunity to have new sales representatives join their company from the previous company. And so there's really a lot of change, a lot to think about in developing new hire training with all of these different lenses. And so we had to think about what a strategic blueprint would look like to address this need for consistency, yet be flexible across all of these areas. And so we started by taking a global approach and looking not only at the assets that the clients provided to us, but conducting global stakeholder interviews to understand the current learning journey and the vision for learning and what they hoped a new hire training would look like. And so we interviewed 30 stakeholders and asked them how they currently deployed training in their business units and across all of these regions, what was successful and what was challenging, what they measured and how they coached, and ultimately what did they expect their learners to know, say, and do at key points in time during the learning journey, during the formal new hire training, and after the new hire training at key points in time. How should the learner, the rep, be functioning over time following their new hire training? And so what we heard, even though we were talking to 5 business units and 5 regions, there was actually a very consistent journey of what the new sales representative had to know and do. And it became clear that first they had to understand the industry that they were working in. Many of them came as new college grads, did not have the experience in the industry, understanding the customers and their business models and all that would influence the customer's decision making. Then, of course, they had to learn the foundational disease state and product knowledge, start to meet their customers and understand their customers' needs, and over time, deepen those relationships, deepen their understanding of product knowledge, their portfolio knowledge, and the clinical knowledge, eventually, ultimately serving as a solution provider for their customers. And that's really being a fully independent, fully equipped representative to be supported by their regional consultant or district manager, but operating on his or her own. And what we learned is that even though this is a consistent journey in terms of what someone needed to know and do, we also heard that there were varying amounts of time that it would take to go from the beginning to the end of the journey. In one business unit, it might be a 30 to 60-day journey all the way to becoming a solution provider. For other business units that were more complex, had more product and different types of customers, it could be a 12 to 18-month journey. And so we knew our curriculum map couldn't be time-bound. It couldn't say exactly when things had to happen, but had to offer a framework that, given the number of learners and the exact content, could be flexible across time. And so our curriculum map, this is not the actual curriculum map, of course, this is a conceptual version of it so you can sort of see the main points. We divided the curriculum map into 4 areas that represent those knowledge areas we discussed before. So what we did here is that although reps were expected to have industry knowledge, it was never part of their new hire training. And so we called it out as a specific part of the curriculum map so that they could focus on how and when to help their reps understand their industry. The next phase is probably very familiar to most of you. It's the more formal new hire training practice phase of articulating the disease state, the product, and practicing their selling skills. Again, we heard in our interviews that they typically were charged with teaching disease state and product information, but the selling skills were actually taught by a different group. And our recommendation, of course, was to integrate those 2 things so that this phase of training was really having the selling skills practiced in the context of the product. That, moving on to the yellow circle, is where the rep is now talking with his or her customers. They're getting real-world experience, honing that knowledge and skills, deepening their knowledge and relationships. And in this case, they're pretty much out of the formal new hire training experience and working back in their sales organization. And so we represented this part of the map saying even though the formal training is done, it's critical to continue the learning. So how could there be support for the learner as they start beyond coaching but actual knowledge events for them? And finally, as they became independent reps and provide solutions to their customers, what's the ongoing training that they need to stay on top of their products and clinical knowledge? And so our curriculum map was divided into these 4 phases, and under each phase you'll see that we outlined the key content, meaning the learning objectives and the topics, the mix of assets, whether that was self-paced, live training, a mix of all of those, and the coaching opportunities and the measurement tools. And so one curriculum map served as this overall planning document that could then become really a common framework or a common language across 5 business units and 5 regions. And so ultimately, the key takeaways that we hope you'll think about from this is that what we learned in this process and what could be helpful to you in this type of process is being certain to gather input from multiple stakeholders, and even at multiple times throughout the journey of creating the map through discovery meetings, interviews, surveys, and validation checkpoints, to look for those consistent themes that you can leverage to increase efficiency and standardization. So what things are common and how can you build those into a standard curriculum, and what things need to be flexible, and allowing for that flexibility between business units or between different parts of the organization and regions so that each local training group can modify it to be specific to their needs. So I'll just stop for a moment and Tim ask if there are any questions about this example.
Oh, thanks, Laura. We do not have any questions coming in, but that's a good time to remind folks, if you do have any questions, feel free to type them in at any point throughout today's program.
Great, thanks. And I will turn it over to Kent to take us to the next example.
Thanks, Laura. And case example 2, we define as a startup, but you'll hear as we walk through it, likewise, probably some overlap with other elements. Read the quote: I am a new training manager. I'm about to hire an entirely new sales force, and in preparation for the launch of a new global product in a new sector of the market. How do we make sure that we have a fully integrated strategy that helps us see where we are going and how well we are doing? And the nuance here when we think about a startup versus potentially an evolution is it was definitely a startup, but it had a relationship to a larger parent company. And as you can see, that will bring influence, or as you might know, that would bring influence. And so as we start to consider some of those parameters, pending product launch, new sector, relatively well-known, established company who has expectations, you can see that the immediate thing to consider is that you have a timeline. There is a concerted effort to invest in a new business unit and go to market with something that is believed to and expected to be very successful. An existing company is going to look for experienced reps, and in a new sector with a new product, experience is very different. You aren't necessarily going to find people that have specific disease state clinical experience. It's going to be more selling experience, relative experience. So when you start to think about the 5 components that we discussed, content, the type of delivery and the way you're conveying that content, you have to immediately think deep knowledge, comprehension, analysis around very new terminologies for very experienced reps. So as we break down this journey, knowing the timeline, you can see that's the first piece for us to understand 8 months before launch, somewhat of a relatively, I'd say, tried and true approach where there's going to be a lot of self-paced training, home study, into a more of an onboarding situation because there's clearly going to be engagement with the company brand, the business unit brand, the product brand, continue to have understanding and buy-in to the patient journey and the attributes of the product, get more into a pre-launch scenario leading to a live meeting. So that piece of it is very familiar, but as you consider those other situational factors, and I bring into it now the global audience, those 5 pieces of strategic solution really start to take shape in a tactical program that's considering all of them in a way that guarantees a more effective learning journey. So if we look at this 8 months to 5 months before launch piece of it and consider the factors that we just outlined, you'll see a couple quick call-outs here. Very heavy in terms of ebooks. What's the reasoning for that? The discovery questions that we referenced earlier and that we recommend you ask, well, a lot of heavy knowledge, a lot of heavy medical terminology, a global audience of experienced reps. So rapid deployment, smaller chunking, so as we think about the type of delivery, consume very detailed content very quickly, and have an understanding of where people are progressing through that journey at smaller touch points. The ebook piece, globalization, localization, translation, if you are deploying this to reps across, let's say, 15 countries, English may be a baseline, but there's potentially also a need in pockets to translate. Ebooks are an asset that make that far easier because typically you're working with something flat that starts as just a Word document and doesn't require a significant amount of interactive development to become a learning delivery mechanism. But at the same time, this is a new sales force, at least within the context of working together. So very early on, we don't want it just to be asynchronous and self-paced. You can see a number of VCTs or virtual classroom trainings and even live classroom trainings. In this particular situation, maybe a bit heavier than it would be in other cases because this is a team that needs to, now thinking about learner engagement, get to know each other, get to know new executives, new manager, new field sales trainers within this business unit. So instead of having an early focus on just deployed asynchronous training, the recommendation here is to think about the engagement very much as part of the mix or delivery mechanism so that there's a real practical piece of people getting to know each other, getting to know how they're learning this very new content, how they're taking to the training. And of course, when you have that aspect of it, coaching is an early adoption recommendation, not something you wait till people get into the field and see if they're using the knowledge that you've taught them asynchronously or in a certification scenario at an event. We recommend coaching right away in that type of situation, so you can see coaching guides have been deployed. So as you lay out those strategic discovery questions and start to think through the considerations in that leading up to the onboarding phase, there's a very clear understanding of how this becomes a strategic oversight that translates into tactics that can accomplish those 5 areas. Carrying through here in the second phase of the journey, it's a similar conversation, but you can start to see the shift that is going into maybe a different balance. And I'm going to point out, because I didn't in that first section, the final assessment. So I reference content, I reference asset mix and delivery, engagement and coaching as they pertain to this case study and the different elements that went into it. Measurement was considered from the beginning. I'll actually go back just to point that out. See this baseline assessment, and something that I should be very explicit about. With each of these ebooks or VCTs, there is also an opportunity to pulse different quizzes, surveys, 3 to 4, 5 question knowledge checks to get a little bit of a sense for how the journey was going. So make sure there's a final assessment in the second phase leading up to the launch event, which we'll show in the next slide. And the criticality of that is, again, with a new sales force in a new sector and a new product and a very rigid timeline, it was critical to understand if the assets that were being developed, if the training materials that were being developed were working. So there was a remediation opportunity very quickly. And so measurement had to be layered on and considered from the beginning to the end of the journey throughout. And then leading up to the live meeting. And the reality is this doesn't necessarily look that different than something that you might be building and deploying in your organization. But what is different is how it pulls through from the previous 2 phases of the journey. And so how all of these culminate from considering those 5 components all together. I'll point out, for example, the Q&A opportunity. And this may be the first time when some of these individuals meet each other in your organization, even if those classroom trainings in the first 2 phases included portions. For this new sales team, you're sure that the live meeting with the entirety of the global sales force brings them together, continues that engagement opportunity. You have those scenarios as well so that you are continuing with that engagement and pull through of content. So this is a great example where it's going to look very similar, but when you start to think through the discovery questions, you can see how this training journey leading up to the launch has to be structured very differently to create a truly strategic learning solution. So we hope that the key takeaways in this case study are, from the very start, focus on the integration of the content delivery and measurement based on knowing exactly what your audience needs, considering where they came from, where they're going, and what has to be accomplished. determine that mix of assets. This term we keep using, and now I have to make sure that we're being clear about, because it is really important to maintain engagement. And so, assets can have many different, permutations. They can look like a video or an audio podcast, but a lot of why and how you make those decisions is reaching the right audience and keeping them engaged. And ensure that the pre-work focuses on knowledge acquisition, particularly in a case where you are a startup. So we go back to it. This is a startup. Almost everything is new to a very experienced learner base. But if that knowledge acquisition is critical foundationally, look for that to be, of course, a building block. So I'm going to turn it back over to Laura for our third and final case. Oh, go ahead, Tim. Questions?
Yeah, I'm sorry if I can jump in real quickly. Someone in the audience is asking if you can explain what VCT stands for.
The question is, VCT is a virtual classroom, meaning a webinar or other Adobe Connect, some sort of classroom where people are similar to now, all together but not physically located in the same room.
Thank you very much.
Great. Great. Thanks, Kent. So our final example is a legacy training situation. And so this is a large pharma company with a long-term, well-experienced training department, very large training group that had been using a mobile platform for their new hire training and product launches for a while. So they are very comfortable with their training models and the use of their mobile platform. But they sort of challenged themselves. They were interested in leveraging all of that platform's capability for a new style of phase 3 training. And that they decided it's time to do something new with the tools they have. So this references earlier when Kent was saying a number of clients that have over time inherited a number of programs and platforms, trying to think about what exists and what could be used differently. And just because we may have folks, phase 3 for this client meant after new hire training and after follow-up training, that's phase 2. Phase 3 is for them a more advanced selling skills training, in case that's a term that might be new for some folks. So think about this as reps who are very experienced and actually led to this kind of use of a mobile platform. These are reps who are out in the field, busy with their customers, don't necessarily want to be able to leave for what would traditionally have been offered as a face-to-face learning experience, a one-week face-to-face advanced skills training. And so the client wanted to also use the mobile platform to help train those reps who are out in the field, busy every day, not necessarily seeing the value or having the time to train in a one-week live environment. And so our challenge really was to take the knowledge that they wanted to share and use the platform to make that happen. And so we started, you can see sort of where we're going with our 5 areas of our blueprint. First, we thought about the content. In this particular situation, the client had conducted a needs analysis with their own internal stakeholders as well as their customers, their physicians, to understand what their reps could be doing to be more strategic selling partners. So the focus of this training was strategic selling. And so we took the findings of the needs analysis and used that to help us determine the content, what was the knowledge, the skills, and the beliefs that we were trying to help these new reps learn and practice. And then we turned our attention to the mobile platform, knowing that the learner and the client are all looking for new ways to learn that fit into their busy selling days. We looked to see whether the platform could offer things such as self-paced learning, social learning, that's learning with one another, and virtual learning, such as what we're doing now. So how could the platform support learning deployment in ways other than coming together face-to-face? Did the platform and did a program like this offer opportunities for ongoing engagement and practice over the length of the course? And were there opportunities for coaching to be integrated and deployed through the virtual mobile platform? And finally, as always, how could the platform be used to deploy measurement tools, and how would that timing work for that? And so what you'll see here is our what we're calling our technology-enabled phase 3 training, and represents, in this case, you're not seeing the actual content of the training because that's one layer deeper than this map. You're really seeing the way that the platform is pulling in all of the other aspects of our blueprint. So very briefly, this is a 6-week course that has both face-to-face and virtual classroom components, e-magazine, which are highly interactive e-books with a business look and feel, very different from the kind of e-books that might be about anatomy and products. This is much more of a magazine feel with self-assessment quizzes, podcasts, and videos embedded right in the magazine. You'll see also, that this is stretched over a 6-week period of time, starting potentially with a face-to-face kickoff and ending with a virtual classroom, but could easily be flipped if there was a meeting happening either at the beginning or end to allow for that flexibility. The CG there stands for Coaching Guide, so you can see we started right up front with sharing Coaching Guide with the managers, setting expectations for what their role was in coaching the learner through this 6-week event. You'll see we have identified potential places where the manager and the learner would check in, and then a second coaching guide to support the pull-through content following the overall course. And that the platform allowed is the deployment of learning assignments. And so we used that opportunity knowing that these learners were going to be, over the course of 6 weeks, learning strategic selling skills and visiting their customers during that period of time, that they could then be given assignments over the course of the program, and assignments that they would have to practice and track and ultimately give a presentation at the end of the course, either to their peers or their manager. Another aspect that the platform allowed for was the social aspect, where there was a chat function, but there could be moderated discussion, so learners could be commenting on what they were learning, as well as we provided to the facilitators questions that aligned with the course content over time, so they could be engaging the learners in discussions around the content that they were following on their own. And then finally, of course, deploying a baseline assessment, a final assessment, and several in between that looked at learners' knowledge, attitudes, and behaviors, as well as the reaction to this type of learning environment. And so some of our key takeaways here are thinking about learner engagement and that mix of assets, looking at how your existing technologies, or even thinking about new technologies to ensure that engaging learning experience, and also challenging yourselves maybe to think about training opportunities where you can test new formats and activities. You may already have a certain way that you do product launches. You might have ways to add some new elements to your launch, or maybe in other types of training, try to evolve the learning into new opportunities such as this one, something that's a little different, engaging for your learners, and getting people excited about learning. And finally, especially when using a platform, consider how it can deliver micro-training or small pieces of training and knowledge check assessments, really taking advantage of the technology so that learners can be using the materials, practicing, reinforcing, and being assessed on their content anywhere, anytime. So I'll just stop for a moment and see if there are questions. We're going to switch gears in just a moment. So Tim, anything we can answer for folks?
We do have some questions that have come in, Laura. I'm going to ask one now in the interest of time, and we'll try to save the others for a little bit later. A good question from Troy. Thinking back to the roadmaps you showed there, Troy noticed that coaching was listed only once, and his question is it assumed that coaching would occur throughout, or was coaching expected to occur once the final assessment happened?
So the assumption is, working with the clients, that there are the identified coaching opportunities. I'm not sure exactly which map he's thinking about, but the idea that we provide a coaching, in these maps, often showing a coaching tool that might say, in week 1, manager, talk to your person about this and ask about that. In week 2, talk about this and ask about that. So it might look like one asset, but is often set up as an ongoing coaching conversation. So depending on how it's deployed might be how it's showing on that map. I don't know, Kent, if you would add anything different there?
Yeah, I think that's right. I mean, it's situational. Certainly in one of the roadmaps, we had coaching in multiple areas. In another, it might have only been in one. I agree. I can't think back directly to the couple we showed. But as long as it's considered, and as long as you understand understand where the need for coaching is, it really should be applied as frequently or as infrequently as the learning strategy requires. I think that's the short answer, and it's something we would love to talk to you more about in detail. But don't overlook it. That's the moral of the story.
Right, and we do have found that for some clients, the training team is setting up the learning, but the sales team is doing the coaching, and so there is that integration of the two teams and what is sort of the cultural relationship between those two groups and how that can be deployed.
And Laura, one more quick question from Christy. Christy is asking if you can elaborate a little bit on what the content is included in the ebooks and the podcast. What sort of content?
So if that was in terms of the last example for the strategic selling, in that case, the strategic selling focus was on understanding the customer situation, particularly in light of the Affordable Care Act and what has been changing. So the ebooks and podcasts were customer stories and even patient stories to help the rep understand how their customers' lives are changing and how the rep would then change their approach to the customer. So it was really content that was not specific selling content as much as content to help them understand, even as Kent said earlier, how the context of their sales is changing. And I think we can go on to Kent.
I was just going to say, I think it's a great segue. So we want to spend just a few minutes on a number of slides, but we'll touch on them very briefly because really they're a precursor to the handout to which you can download. We're going to provide a link at the end, and it may also be provided in the chat window. It's our gift to you. We think it's a really good tool that can be useful in helping you think this through and not forget some key areas. If you think back to that diagram we did that really looks somewhat like a 3D visualization of a blueprint, that first step is defining your objectives and content, and that really goes to the questions that were just asked. If your learning objectives, if I'm looking at that last bullet, are specific to making sure there is a understanding and engagement with the patient journey or potentially a different journey, then that's where the content needs to be developed, and that's why an ebook might be focused on that area as well as a podcast. So there are 4 bullets here, and these are always some that you want to consider in step 1 while you define the objectives and content. Laura, why don't you tell us about step 2?
Sure. So in mapping the learner experience, so you've heard us talk about sort of phases of knowledge and also talking about phases of types of studies. So when you get to mapping your experience, you might think about it as we showed in the first example, which is understanding the industry and then understanding the products. That's one way to define phases. Another way to define phases are, you'll be having home study, a live event, and pull-through. So you think about what your phases are, identify the best mix of assets and delivery. So if it's home study, is it ebooks and virtual classrooms? Is it live training when you come together? Those kind of things. Those two go together. What are your phases, and then what can you deploy during those phases? Thinking about pulsing the information out so it's not too much information at any one time or any one phase so that folks really can absorb it and act on it. And then what we learned in doing our stakeholder interviews and validation of some of our curriculum maps, we heard from our clients that seeing the curriculum map themselves, they saw as a value for learners, so helping learners see their way on the journey. We don't necessarily see giving the learner the entire curriculum map, but what we're calling here an example of a learner roadmap. Again, this is a conceptual one and not the actual roadmap. The idea is that this roadmap tells someone what they should do, in this case, listen to something, read something, and join a webinar, so it tells them what assets they're going to experience. And then you can include opportunities on this roadmap for them to take notes. You can give them questions to reflect on or activities to practice, so that it's a way of someone looking at their entire learning journey about what they are about to experience and helping them take notes and practice along the way. So knowing that we see curriculum maps as really beneficial to our clients, we also see them as helpful to the learner, maybe just in a revised look and feel. The next piece, planning for learner engagement. We talked a little bit about gamification and competition is one way of engaging your learners. Another is to think about adopting a model or philosophy of learning so that you're, again, just encouraging yourself to think of all the different ways you could position the learning and design an experience that engages people over time. And we're going to share two models very, very briefly that we keep in mind. The first is called the AGES model, which was developed by the Neuro Leadership Institute, Josh Davis and his colleagues. And the second is the 70-20-10 approach, which was actually developed in the 1980s by the Center for Creative Leadership. So neither of these is a ClearPoint model, but they offer us a framework for thinking about how to engage learners over time. And so very briefly, the AGES model has 4 principles that are, these 4 principles help create the optimal condition for learning. So making sure you are gaining and holding your learners' focus, gaining their attention with creative elements or a mix of different assets and speakers, that you're helping them generate or make meaning through all of the kinds of assignments and role plays and learning activities we've talked about, that you're helping them engage their positive emotions as part of learning, and that can be done through social and collaborative learning, gamification or competition. And finally, as we've mentioned, spacing the learning over time to avoid cognitive overload. So this is one way that as you're creating your blueprint, to look at it and say, am I really using all 4 elements as I put my blueprint together? Another way, a different way to think about how to engage your learners is what's called the 70-20-10 model. Of course, some more recent reading about this says, well, maybe those percentages aren't exactly right. This was developed before the age of the internet and all of the social learning, but the idea is the same, that people learn in all different ways, and they've found that people learn their jobs mostly by doing their jobs. So experiential learning, which is meeting their customers, developing their pre-call plans, developing their strategy, or being given a certain learning assignment to work through. So would your curriculum allow for that? Does your curriculum allow for social learning? So that's learning from one another, being coached by their managers, mentored by experienced peers, or even helping them follow thought leaders in the space so that they can learn from each other in a less formal way. And finally, and I hate to say it because most of us spend most of our lives doing justice, which is design formal learning, it may only make up 10% of how people learn about their jobs. So as you think about your strategic blueprint, are you including opportunities for all of these types of learning? And so we offer it in that spirit to be thinking about different ways of engaging your learners. And I'll turn it back to you, Kent.
Yeah, great. Thank you, Laura. I know we're coming towards the bottom of the presentation, and I want to make sure we get these last 2 points in because they're critical. We've referenced coaching several times, and we had a great question about coaching. And we really did touch on, can it occur throughout the journey in both veins? But who's available to coach? It's something we haven't talked about much. What are the resources in terms of personnel that are available? And do they need to be trained on certain topics or content areas? Key consideration as a branch for a learning journey or a use of resources within. And then what assets or formats are most valuable to your teams? We think about coaching in face-to-face settings. Increasingly, people are using digital training tools, mobile applications, depending on device availability. All very important questions to ask as we address where and how frequently coaching should be considered as part of that strategic plan. And then we talked about measurement as well, and that is a critical step, certainly the 5th one in our outline, but not the last in terms of importance. And increasingly so with an industry, I think we're all talking about how to measure more effectively, how to measure differently. When and how will you capture assessment data? We showed you an example that had a baseline and a final assessment, but we also talked about pulsing and doing knowledge checks. That provides opportunities for remediation. If that's needed, ask the question. Where are opportunities for different types of measurement that might be a little bit more qualitative? Practice of verbalization, certification, role play. And how do you measure that? That's not always the easiest question to answer. Sometimes there's a bit of shyness around things that are qualitative, but it's important to think about and create for a plan. I'm really going to fly through these last 2, but again, looks like a very typical training journey to many of you, something that you've experienced. It may have a different flavor. And you can see, right, as we map out something in a new hire scenario, that you have some of these asynchronous activities leading up to certifications. put a different lens on. Think about where you can measure. We've talked in this forum before about ClearPoint's approach to measuring behavior, something we're happy to talk about more. But when you consider a training journey that may already exist and you're thinking strategically about refreshing it, is there an opportunity to overlay different assessment opportunities, different measurement opportunities? So I think our final takeaways for you are that a strategic blueprint provides that big picture view for planning. Many of you think about these types of situations in your business and the different, I'd say, shared scenarios around them. This should give you a framework for evaluating programs that currently exist and new ones alike. And the download that we'll provide is a tool that can help you prioritize the investments around learning and to get the most out of your training. Tim, I know we're right against the 1:30. Hopefully we can stick around for a couple more minutes to do some questions. And before that, for those of you that don't know ClearPoint Learning, we are a 15-year-old business focused exclusively on delivering exceptional training solutions in the life sciences industry. We're a global organization as well. We have offices here in the United States as well as in Asia and in Europe. And we would love to work even more around the globe. It's something that I think is increasingly a consideration for everyone out in the audience. We have a couple things that we'd like to tell you about real briefly before we jump into questions. We have referenced that download, basically the tool that brings together a lot of the discussion points within this presentation. That's the link here on the right-hand side, and it may be going into the chat window. And we also have an event coming up. If you're in or around the Princeton, New Jersey area, we have a dinner next week, April 19th, with Dr. Carl Kopp, someone that has presented both for LTEN and with us for LTEN, to talk more about strategies that help engage your sales force. It's a topic that we discuss a lot with Carl, who's a friend and partner to ClearPoint, specifically around some of our measurement efforts, but engagement with your learner base is a big piece that really, I think, a precursor, frankly, to getting the right measurement situation going. So with that, Tim, let's see if there's some questions, and if we can, maybe extend this a few minutes for people that are interested.
Well, thanks, Kent. Great presentation from you and Laura. Folks, we are going to go a little bit over. We understand if you've got conflicts and have to leave. The program is being recorded. We're going to take some questions now, but the program is being recorded. If you have to check out, you can always check back and hear what you've missed here at the end as we wrap up. And we do have some great questions coming in as well. Let me start with this one. How long should we spend on building a strategic blueprint?
Laura, I'll let you take that one. We still have Laura. Tim, can you hear me?
Oh,
I sure
sorry.
can.
I was on.
There we go.
Sorry.
Okay. Go ahead, Laura.
I put myself on mute. Sorry. Yeah, there's a number of factors that will lead to how long it will take to do your solution blueprint. So depending on whether you're actually doing interviews, reviewing assets, gathering your stakeholder input, those things are the time-consuming things. The actual creation of the blueprint should probably itself only take a couple of days. It's really all of those steps in terms of gathering assets, gathering feedback, drafting and validating. It could take several weeks. Thank you.
Well, thank you. Another good question. Which of the 5 areas, we've talked about the 5 areas, which of the 5 areas is most critical when considering a strategic blueprint?
Yeah, I'll take that one, Tim. I think the answer is, well, of course, we think they're all important, or we wouldn't have outlined them. And really that is the answer, which is at least to ask the question about which ones apply. Clearly, understanding the content and the asset mix or delivery are ones that I think we can pretty safely say apply to any situation. The challenge I would give back to the audience and to anyone asking that question is they're all important enough to at least address and dismiss. If you don't believe that engagement is a critical piece of a particular solution or strategy, that's fine as long as you've asked the question.
Excellent, thank you. I have another sort of level-setting jargon type of question. Can you explain what you mean by pull-through?
Sure. Laura, do you want to take that one? Yeah.
Sure. Yep. Thanks. So many of our, thank you for asking us to clarify that too. Pull-through is often referred to as another way of saying refresher content or reinforcement content. So many times it's happened after a live training event, either a virtual classroom or a live meeting, and then the desire to keep that content fresh over time. There are ways to deploy either content summaries, knowledge assessments, different ways for people to be reminded of and practice that content that they learned in the live event. So it's used to describe that.
Excellent. Thank you. And we have a question, and this is a good question from Gladys in the audience. We talked about coaching and whatnot. Can you share anything regarding having a strong content and a similar strategic plan for manager coaches? How do you differentiate that approach when you're training managers to be coaches, I believe?
I'm going to repeat the question.
Yeah.
Sure. Yeah, so at least in the programs that we've shared today and talked about coaching, we've seen it as some of the key things that we talk about is first, making sure that coaches understand the content of the program, so whether that's a product launch or more strategic selling skills, that the coaches are aware of everything that's being taught to the learner, whether that's through content summaries or even a virtual classroom session with the coaches so that they know what their learners will be learning. And then typically we recommend providing, questions that are pulsed out against the time of the learning journey. So what questions or observations should the coaches be doing at any point in time relative to what the person is learning? And then depending on, in talking with our clients, understanding the skill level of their coaches, we sometimes offer those particular tips for observing or measuring progress and giving feedback. So those are typically at least 3 of the elements that we would recommend including in a coaching strategy. Kent, I don't know if you would add any more there.
No, I think that's a great answer, Laura. Really good stuff.
Great, thank you. I just have a couple of questions coming in, folks. We do have some time. If you have any additional questions, send them in. Even if we don't get to them here on the call, we can take them offline.
We're happy to hang out.
There you go. Everybody's happy to hang out. Christy's asked a good question about gamification. Do you know what the most common gamification tactics are related to content retention? This may be a question for your Carl Top session.
Yeah, I think it is, and I will not, and Laura, I'll take a first crack at it and feel free to contribute. I'm not going to pretend to answer this as an expert. Carl's the first person to tell you that research is really, I think, in its infant stages around that type of question. So most of the evidence or answer that we can provide is qualitative. In terms of retention, I think that the key elements right now are being done in, question of the day, gamified type settings. So, pulsing out with some of the well-known solutions out in the market, follow-up questions that result in points and a leaderboard type situation. So, questions on their own are certainly not a game element, but adding points and a competitive scenario to them, that's certainly being done very widely. I think oftentimes people are then doing non-required, very well-known type game frameworks that emulate game shows on TV that have a knowledge base attached to it or a question pool attached to it, and they give credit for it, but again, add some type of competitive element. So those are the things we're seeing the most. I think in the last 6 to 8 months, companies have started to realize that even those are potentially becoming a bit banal to some of the learner base, so they're getting even more creative and trying to find different ways.
Yeah, and actually I'd love to add something there, which is some of the research that we have seen has also talked about the benefit of gamification really being in the engagement access and less about, so far, the research not necessarily saying it's the key to retention, but that it is a key in helping people stay involved in the learning and be open to the learning. So, that's an important mindset too. It's really a motivator for learning. It may not be any more or less effective in the retention.
Excellent, thank you. We jumping back one question to the coaching question. Rodney asked a great follow-up here. Would it not be more effective to put coaches through the training content before the field learners, or do you think it's sufficient to just keep the coaching and managers, coaches and managers in the loop with the content?
It is a great question, so thanks for going back to it. In some instances, depending on the training situation, for example, in a product launch, we have done exactly what is being suggested, which is have the managers experience the full content and then become coaches. In others, depending on the content area, for some, the content that's being taught might just simply need a refresher for the managers. It may be something that they know but need just a little bit of an update. So depending on the availability of the managers and sort of the cross-departmental relationship between learning and sales, you know, that relationship and time being spent in that, I would say it's certainly not a bad idea, especially if it's brand new content that the managers won't know. I would agree that they would need some way of experiencing the content so that they could be coaches for the theme. Thank you.
Thank you. I do have another question. It might be a little bit off topic here, but I'm going to go ahead and put it out there, but we can, you know, take it offline as well. Joseph is asking about GXP training. He's, do you have any advice on the type of training for the GXP training professionals? How to deal with challenges presented by lack of technology? Often companies want to deploy cutting-edge training platforms but have no technology platform to support it.
Yeah, that's a really good question. I do have some GXP training experience from a previous life before I worked at ClearPoint, and I think that those are well-known challenges, particularly when you look at compliance-driven training initiatives where e-signatures, read and acknowledge, you know, heavy emphasis on items like policies, SOPs, you know, that require deep sort of understanding of very rigorous materials. There are no great answers. I think a lot of it goes back to, again, looking at around your organization and seeing what is at your disposal, because, of course, making sure that you have that audit trail tends to be the critical piece. I think what the recommendation I would actually make is to go back to that asset mix and delivery question in advance of some of the technologies, because engaging your learners and making sure that key issues are retained, mapping out which policies and procedures are the most critical from a risk mitigation perspective, and maybe attaching some of those game frameworks that we talked to, for example, around them, so that you're not looking at a heavy technology investment, but more you can get the read and acknowledge where you need it with either, you know, a rudimentary e-signature capability or even a paper-based approach, but then you're truly understanding learner evolution through knowledge retention and engagement scenarios that give you a much better pulse on, you know, are people actually understanding the GXP content in a way that's going to ensure that we're not misstepping. So not necessarily as clear an answer that I think you were hoping for, but just trying to, again, point back to some of those tools that we believe might actually be the best place to focus in this scenario.
And Joseph, I'm going to jump in there as well, just in case you don't know. We hope you're planning to attend this. Oh, and Joseph says, thank you for the excellent suggestions. Joseph, thank you. Joseph, I hope you're planning to attend the LTEN conference this year. It'll be this June. And we have a new, brand new this year, a GXP training track. So hopefully you'll be able to talk to some experts there as well and learn a lot more about your questions and the issues. Kent and Laura, I'm going to ask one last question, and folks, thanks for bearing with us out there in the audience. Another question from Gladys. Gladys is asking if you have any final additional measurement recommendations specifically around level
5. Tim, was that about level 5, did you say?
Yes, it was, yes. Any
okay.
measurement recommendations around level 5, yes.
Well, I can start, and then Kent, I don't know if you would want to add. Certainly in some of the curriculum and measurement planning we have done with our clients, you know, we have acknowledged that the challenge of the learning and development group, you know, not always having access to the data that they need to do a full level 5 evaluation. We have helped our clients identify their own questions and sort of think through their how they would gather the data on, you know, on sales, on their competitors, and all of those things that would impact knowing whether or not training had an impact on their learners. I don't know, it's a very complex, I understand why Gladys is asking the question. It's complicated. We have found from our, at least in the projects I have worked on, we've supported our clients in helping identify those questions, but I don't know, Kent, if you can talk more about any of the experience you've had there too.
Yeah, I mean, I think this is a tough one, right? So the idea of level 5, and assuming without stating explicitly they were talking about level 5 as ROI, that we have taken a different approach around the ROI conversation, whereby we know a lot of our customers are looking at usage analytics to justify where they've spent money in training programs. We also know that people are looking at, honestly, happy sheets, satisfaction, what worked well. Some of the references we made to measuring behavior change specific to either programs as a whole or parts of the program. So, putting a behavior-based assessment before and after the onboarding session, for example, or a specific series of ebooks. We believe that if you can demonstrate on a normative basis that those behaviors have changed in a positive way and to your liking, mapped against the actions associated with them, you can very clearly show that the training or the assets or the investment worked, and attach that back to dollars. So that's one way that we've considered. But I think if you're not using our behavioral approach, the recommendation I would make is to actually take that measurement on more of an interval-based approach so that ROI isn't waiting till the end. Show some level of change over the course of the program and then attach it with specificity to ROI as it pertains to the pieces that you've invested in.
Excellent. Well, thank you both very much. Folks, I'm going to go ahead and let us all out of here now. We appreciate your patience. Let me just wrap up with some thank yous. You've seen here that, of course, that Kent and Laura have shared their email addresses, and the information was shared also through the chat window on the dinner with Dr. Carl Kopp and the downloading the audit strategy and the learning strategy. So if you have any questions about that, certainly feel free to reach out to us. We can connect with ClearPoint, or of course I'm sure Kent and Laura would be happy to hear from you directly as well. And with all that said, I'm going to just end with, I mentioned the conference coming up and our new GXP track that came up today. We're happy to hear that. We hope you can join us for our conference. It's going to be June 13th and 16th in National Harbor, Maryland, just outside D.C. Registration is still available, and we would love to have a big conference this year. More than 70 workshops, 10 learning tracks, a new GXP track, 70 solution providers, including, I believe, ClearPoint, and more than 750 peers are going to be there to share with you, to network and share ideas. So we hope you can join us for that. And I also wanted to tell you about, we've got a few upcoming webinars. You'll see them here on the screen. We'll be back on April 29th with a thought leader panel discussion on bringing meaningful value through digital learning. And then Dr. Travis Bradbury is joining us on May 6th to talk about emotional intelligence. You can register for those programs now at this address here, LTEN.org/webinars. Today's webinar, as a reminder, is being recorded and will be archived shortly to l-10.org/webinar archives. We're also going to send you an email about 1 hour from now connecting you to that recording as well. So certainly we hope you are able to join us for that. And finally, my email address is here at the bottom of the screen. If I can help you again before, during, or after our webinars, as I mentioned, please don't hesitate to reach out. So let me send a few final thank yous. Kent Malmros and Laura Wilson, our speakers today. Our speakers today. Great job, both of you. Thank you both.
Thank you, Tim. Appreciate it.
Thank you. It's always a pleasure. I also want to thank ClearPoint Learning, our sponsors today. We appreciate bringing the program to us, and I'm sure everyone in the audience does as well. And that's my final thank you. I wanted to make sure I thank everybody in the audience for your time and participation throughout today's webinar. You're staying over a little bit later as your schedule allows, and certainly for joining us in the first place. We look forward to seeing you back here for our next webinars, and in the meantime, let me wish you a good rest of your day, a good rest of your week, and we will talk to you all soon. Bye-bye, everybody.